In the vast emptiness of the Gobi Desert, where sand dunes stretched endlessly under a merciless sun and temperatures swung from scorching heat to bone-chilling cold, a group of Chinese soldiers stumbled upon something that would shake the very foundations of their nation's sense of security and forever alter the course of Cold War history. Half buried in the yellow sand and wind-swept grassland, twisted metal gleamed under the harsh morning light. At first glance, the patrol leader thought it might be a meteorite, perhaps debris from one of the Soviet satellites that occasionally tumbled from orbit. But as his men began to clear away the debris and brush aside the accumulated dust of what appeared to be several days of exposure to the elements, the markings became unmistakable. English letters, American manufacturing stamps, serial numbers that meant nothing to these simple soldiers, but would soon send shockwaves through Beijing's highest corridors of power, and a shape that defied anything they had ever seen before in their military training or their wildest imaginations. The year was 1971, a time when the Cold War had reached a peculiar crossroads. China had been conducting nuclear tests at the Lopnor facility deep in the remote Xinjiang region, a place so isolated that it might as well have been on the surface of the moon. The Chinese leadership believed their secrets were safe from prying eyes, protected by thousands of miles of inhospitable terrain, protected by the sheer impossibility of anyone getting close enough to see what was happening in those desolate testing grounds. They were wrong. The Americans had been watching, and this wreckage, this twisted piece of black metal that had fallen from the sky, was the irrefutable proof of that surveillance. But before we dive deeper into this incredible story of espionage, technological marvel, Cold War paranoia, and the unintended consequences of pushing the boundaries of what was possible, make sure to hit that subscribe button and give this video a like. Trust me, you won't want to miss what comes next in this fascinating chapter of history that remained classified for decades. The story of how this mysterious aircraft ended up in the Chinese desert begins not in the desolate wastelands of Central Asia, not in the secret bunkers of Washington, but in the sunny hills of Burbank, California, in a facility so secret that even most of Lockheed's own employees had no idea it existed. There, behind unmarked doors and windowless walls, a man named Clarence Leonard Kelly Johnson was about to push the boundaries of aviation technology into realms that had previously existed only in science fiction. He would create something that would fly faster than a rifle bullet, higher than any aircraft before it, and do so without a human pilot on board. Kelly Johnson was not just any aircraft designer. He was quite simply the greatest aeronautical engineer of the 20th century, a man whose creations had helped win World War II and would go on to define American air power for generations. Born in 1910 in Ishpeming, Michigan, to Swedish immigrant parents, Johnson had shown an early aptitude for engineering that bordered on the supernatural. By the age of 13, he had designed his first aircraft. By 23, he had corrected a fundamental flaw in Lockheed's Model 10 Electra that the company's senior engineers had missed, earning him instant credibility in launching a career that would span 5 decades. His list of achievements read like a history of American aviation itself. The P-38 Lightning, the twin-boomed fighter that had terrorized Axis powers in both theaters of World War II, the F-104 Starfighter, the first aircraft to hold simultaneous records for speed, altitude, and rate of climb, the C-130 Hercules, the rugged transport that would serve air forces around the world for more than 60 years in counting, and most importantly for our story, the U-2 spy plane, the aircraft that had given America its first real window into Soviet military capabilities and had forever changed the nature of intelligence gathering. Johnson's secret weapon was not just his engineering genius, though that was formidable. It was his ability to build teams and cut through bureaucracy. In 1943, he had established what became known as the Skunk Works, a semi-autonomous division within Lockheed that operated under its own rules. The name came from the Lyle Abner comic strip, a reference to the Skunk Works, where a mysterious and malodorous brew was concocted. The Skunk Works operated on principles that were revolutionary for their time and remain influential today. Small teams, direct communication, minimal paperwork, maximum authority for engineers, and absolute secrecy. Under Johnson's leadership, the Skunk Works had produced the U-2 in just 8 months from conception to first flight, an achievement that modern aerospace programs could only dream of replicating. They had done it with a team of just 50 engineers working in conditions that would give modern safety inspectors heart attacks, driven by nothing but the knowledge that their country needed them to succeed and the fear of what would happen if they failed. The U-2 had been Johnson's response to a specific problem that had plagued American intelligence since the early days of the Cold War. The Soviet Union was vast, secretive, and paranoid. Traditional intelligence methods, human spies, and signal intercepts could only reveal so much. What America needed was the ability to see inside the Soviet Empire, to photograph their military bases, their missile sites, their industrial facilities, and most importantly, their nuclear weapons development programs. The U-2 solved this problem elegantly. Flying at over 70,000 FT, far above the reach of Soviet interceptors and, it was believed, Soviet radars, the U-2 could cruise over denied territory with impunity, its cameras capturing images of stunning clarity. For 4 years, from 1956 to 1960, U-2 flights provided an unprecedented intelligence windfall. America learned where the Soviets kept their bombers, where they tested their missiles, where they built their submarines. The information was invaluable, and it came at essentially no risk, or so it seemed. On May 1st, 1960, everything changed. Francis Gary Powers, a CIA pilot flying a U-2 over Soviet territory, was shot down by a newly developed SA-2 surface-to-air missile. Power survived the shootdown and was captured by Soviet forces. The incident was an international catastrophe. A summit meeting between President Eisenhower and Soviet Premier Khrushchev collapsed. The Cold War entered a new and more dangerous phase, and the era of manned reconnaissance flights over hostile territory effectively came to an end. The loss of Powers, and as U-2 sent shockwaves through the American intelligence community, the U-2 program had been one of their most valuable assets, providing intelligence that simply could not be obtained any other way. Now it was gone, not because the aircraft had failed, but because the political cost of sending pilots over enemy territory had become unacceptable. One more shoot-down, one more captured pilot, and the diplomatic consequences could be catastrophic. Kelly Johnson understood the problem immediately. The U-2 had been compromised, not by any technical failure, but by its fundamental vulnerability. A human pilot meant a human prisoner if things went wrong. A human prisoner meant a diplomatic incident. The solution, Johnson realized, was to remove the human from the equation entirely. The concept of unmanned reconnaissance was not new. Crewed drones had been used for target practice and basic reconnaissance since World War I. But what Johnson envisioned was something entirely different. He wanted to build an unmanned aircraft that could fly higher and faster than any manned plane, penetrate the most heavily defended airspace on Earth, photograph its targets, and return its cargo of intelligence without ever putting a human life at risk. The project was designated D-21, the 21st in a series of drone concepts that Lockheed's Skunk Works had developed. But the D-21 was unlike anything that had come before. Previous drones had been slow, relatively simple devices. The D-21 would be a technological marvel, pushing the absolute limits of what 1960s engineering could achieve. The specifications were staggering. The D-21 would fly at speeds exceeding Mach 3, more than 3 times the speed of sound, or roughly 2,300 mph. At that speed, a rifle bullet would be left far behind. The aircraft would cruise at altitudes above 90,000 ft in the thin air, where the sky turns from blue to black, and the curvature of the Earth becomes visible. At these extremes, conventional aircraft designs simply would not work. Johnson and his team had to invent entirely new solutions to problems that no one had ever faced before. The challenges began with the most basic element of any aircraft: its skin. At Mach 3, air friction heats an aircraft's surface to temperatures exceeding 600 degrees F. Aluminum, the material of choice for conventional aircraft, would soften and deform at these temperatures. Steel would add too much weight. Johnson's team turned to titanium, a metal that was incredibly strong, incredibly heat-resistant, and incredibly difficult to work with. Titanium could not be cut, drilled, or shaped using conventional tools. It required entirely new manufacturing techniques developed from scratch by Lockheed's engineers. The engine presented even greater challenges. At Mach 3, conventional jet engines simply cannot function. The air entering the intake is moving so fast and compressing so violently that traditional turbine blades would be destroyed. The D-21 would be powered by a ramjet, a beautifully simple engine concept that had been theorized for decades but rarely implemented successfully. A ramjet has no moving parts. It relies entirely on the aircraft's forward motion to compress incoming air, which is then mixed with fuel and ignited. The resulting combustion provides thrust. The elegance of the design is that it becomes more efficient the faster it goes. The problem is that it only works at very high speeds. Below about Mach 2, a ramjet simply will not function. The D-21 would need another way to reach its operating speed. Johnson's solution was elegant in its audacity. The D-21 would be carried to altitude and speed by a mothership, a modified A-12, the predecessor to the famous SR-71 Blackbird. The A-12 was itself a marvel of engineering, capable of sustained Mach 3 flight, and developed by the Skunk Works under conditions of such secrecy that even its existence remained classified for decades. A special variant designated M21 was created with a pylon on its back to carry the D-21. The plan called for the M21 to accelerate to Mach 3 at high altitude, at which point the D-21 would separate, ignite its ramjet, and continue on its solo journey into enemy airspace. The concept of launching one aircraft from another was not new. It had been done with the X-15 rocket plane and other experimental vehicles, but those had been relatively low-speed launches, nothing like what Johnson was proposing. Separating two aircraft at Mach 3 in the ED, thin air above 80,000 ft with both vehicles moving at over 2,000 mph was an aerodynamic challenge of unprecedented complexity. The margin for error was essentially zero. Any unexpected movement during separation could cause the two aircraft to collide with catastrophic results. Development of the D-21 began in earnest in 1962. Even as the U-2 program was still reeling from the P incident, the project was classified at the highest levels, with access restricted to a tiny group of engineers, pilots, and intelligence officials. Even within the Skunk Works, most employees had no idea that the D-21 existed. Those who did work on the program signed oaths of secrecy that would bind them for life. Many went to their graves without ever telling their families what they had accomplished. Testing began at Area 51, the legendary test facility in the Nevada desert that had also been home to U-2 development and would later host testing of the A-12 and SR-71. The isolation of the base was perfect for the D-21 program. There were no prying eyes, no curious journalists, no foreign intelligence agents with high-powered cameras. Whatever happened at Area 51 stayed at Area 51. The early captive carry tests with the D-21 attached to the M21 but not released were encouraging. The two aircraft flew well together, and the aerodynamic predictions proved accurate. The separation tests, however, were another matter entirely. The violence of separating at Mach 3 created turbulence that threatened to destabilize both aircraft. Small modifications were made, tested, refined, tested again. Progress was slow but steady. By 1965, the program was ready for its first free-flight test. On March 5th of that year, an M21 piloted by Bill Park climbed to over 80,000 IFT, accelerated to Mach 3.225 and released its D-21 payload. The drone's ramjet ignited perfectly, and for a few glorious minutes, both aircraft flew in formation, the D-21 accelerating away toward its programmed flight path. Then, as designed, the D-21 shut down its engine and descended toward a recovery point in the Pacific Ocean. The cameras aboard would have captured images, but on this test flight, the camera bay was empty. This was purely a proof of concept, and the concept had been proven. The D-21 could fly. More test flights followed over the next year, each one pushing the envelope a little further, testing different systems, refining the separation procedure, validating the recovery concept. The D-21 would fly its mission, then eject its camera package via parachute over international waters. A specially equipped aircraft, either a modified transport or helicopter, would snatch the parachute in mid-air. The D-21 itself, its mission complete, would self-destruct, plunging into the ocean and leaving no evidence of American activities. The system was complex with many potential failure points, but complexity was unavoidable given the mission requirements. The CIA and Air Force wanted an intelligence capability that could penetrate the most heavily defended airspace on Earth, photograph the most sensitive targets, and return that intelligence without any risk of international incident. The D-21 was their answer, however imperfect. On July 30th, 1966, the program suffered a tragedy that would alter its entire future. An M21 piloted by Bill Park, with Launch Control Officer Ray Torrey in the back seat, took off from Area 51 for what was supposed to be a routine launch test over the Pacific Ocean. Park was one of Lockheed's most experienced test pilots, a man who had pushed aircraft to their limits countless times. Torque was equally skilled, a launch control specialist who understood the D-21 system better than almost anyone alive. The flight proceeded, normally until the moment of separation. As the D-21 released from its pylon, something went wrong. Instead of dropping away cleanly, the drone pitched up, its nose rising sharply. In a fraction of a second, the D-21 collided with the M21's fuselage. The impact at Mach 2 was devastating. The M21 broke apart almost instantly, its titanium skin shredding like paper in the violent aerodynamic forces. Park and Torrey ejected from the disintegrating aircraft into the thin, cold air above 80,000 Traum. Their ejection seats had been designed for exactly this scenario, but nothing could fully prepare a human body for ejection at Mach 3. Both men survived the initial ejection and descended toward the Pacific Ocean, their parachutes deploying automatically. Park hit the water hard but survived. He was rescued by a Navy helicopter within the hour, shaken and bruised, but fundamentally intact. He would fly again. Torque was not so fortunate. His survival suit, designed to protect him from the cold Pacific waters, had a flaw. A seal had failed during the high-altitude ejection, and water began seeping in almost immediately after he hit the ocean. By the time rescue helicopters reached his position, Ray Tour had drowned. He was 38 years old. He left behind a wife and children who would never know the true circumstances of his death. The accident report was classified for decades, and his family was told only that he had died in a training accident. Kelly Johnson was devastated by Tour's death. He had known both men personally, had worked with them through countless test flights, had trusted them with his most advanced creation. The loss hit him hard, both personally and professionally. He made a decision that day that would define the program's future course. Never again would the D-21 be launched from a manned aircraft. The risk was simply too great. If something went wrong during separation, there was no way for a pilot to react quickly enough to save himself. The math was unforgiving, the physics merciless. Another M21 launch could mean another dead crew member. Johnson would not accept that risk. The solution came from an unexpected direction. The B-52 Stratofortress, the giant bomber that formed the backbone of America's nuclear deterrent, would become the D-21's new launch platform. The B-52 was no Mach 3 aircraft. It could barely exceed 600 mph, but it could carry the D-21 to high altitude and release it at a speed sufficient for a rocket booster to accelerate the drone to ramjet ignition velocity. This new configuration was designated D-21B, and the program received a new codename, Senior Bull. The complexity of the mission had increased significantly. Now, instead of a simple separation and ramjet ignition, the D-21B would have to ignite a solid rocket booster after release from the B-52, accelerate through the transonic region where aerodynamic forces were at their most violent, reach Mach 3, and then jettison the spent booster and continue on ramjet power. Each additional step was another potential failure point, but each additional step also meant another layer of protection for the humans involved. The launch aircraft, modified B-52H bombers, were based at Beale Air Force Base in California, the same facility that hosted the SR-71 Blackbird fleet. The connection was not coincidental. Beale was home to the Strategic Reconnaissance Wing, a unit so secret that even its existence was classified for years. The men who flew and maintained these aircraft were among the most carefully vetted individuals in the United States military.